When basketball legend Michael Jordan unexpectedly spots his long-lost childhood friend Leroy Wilson flipping burgers at a McDonald's in their hometown, he's shocked by how differently their lives turned out. Instead of simply walking away, Michael makes a decision that will forever change both their lives and impact an entire community. What begins as a chance encounter leads to an extraordinary act of friendship that nobody could have predicted, proving that sometimes the most meaningful slam dunks happen off the court. Michael Jordan was tired, the kind of bone-deep tired that came from too many meetings and not enough sleep. His private jet had landed in Wilmington, North Carolina just an hour ago, and all he wanted was to get to his hotel and crash. But his stomach rumbled, reminding him he hadn't eaten since breakfast. He spotted the golden arches of McDonald's up ahead and pulled his sleek black SUV into the parking lot. It wasn't his usual choice, but something about being back in his hometown made him crave the simple comfort food from his youth. "Baseball cap," he muttered to himself, reaching into the glove compartment. Even at 61, Michael couldn't go anywhere without being recognized. The cap was pulled low over his eyes as he walked through the door. The McDonald's was busy, but not packed. A mix of teenagers, tired parents with energetic kids, and workers on late shifts. Michael got in line, keeping his head down, scanning the menu even though he already knew what he wanted. "Welcome to McDonald's. May I take your order?" the cashier asked, not looking up from her register. "Quarter pounder with cheese, large fries, and a Coke," Michael said, his voice low. The cashier nodded, still not making eye contact as she punched in his order. While waiting for his food, Michael's gaze drifted to the kitchen area. The staff moved with practiced efficiency, taking orders, preparing food, cleaning counters. His eyes landed on an older man working the grill. Something about him seemed familiar. The man was tall and lean, with shoulders that still looked strong despite his age. His movements were quick and precise as he flipped burgers, a rhythm to his work that spoke of years of practice. Michael tilted his head, trying to place him. The man turned slightly, and Michael caught a glimpse of his profile. His heart skipped a beat. "No way," he whispered. "Those cheekbones, that chin, the way his brow furrowed in concentration. Even with gray hair and lines around his eyes, Michael would recognize Leroy Wilson anywhere." "Order number 42, called another worker. Michael collected his food in a daze, his appetite suddenly forgotten. He found a booth in the corner with a clear view of the kitchen and sat down. Leroy Wilson, his first real friend, the boy who had taught him how to dribble a basketball between his legs when his hands were barely big enough to control the ball. The friend who had disappeared without a trace right before high school. And now here he was, flipping burgers at McDonald's. Michael unwrapped his burger automatically, his eyes never leaving Leroy. He watched as his old friend wiped sweat from his brow with his forearm, checked the temperature on the grill, and called out instructions to a younger coworker. There was dignity in his movements, a pride in doing his job well. 1,000 questions raced through Michael's mind. What happened to Leroy after he left? Why was he working here at this age? Did he ever play basketball again? Did he have a family? Did he ever think about Michael? Michael took a bite of his burger, barely tasting it. He remembered how fast Leroy had been on the court. "Quick like water," he used to say. He had been the star of their neighborhood, the one everyone said would make it big someday. Now, Michael Jordan was a billionaire, one of the most famous athletes in history, while Leroy Wilson was working a minimum wage job at McDonald's. Life's strange turns haunted Michael as he watched his old friend work. He thought about all the lucky breaks he'd had, the opportunities that had come his way. Had Leroy not gotten those same chances? Or had something else happened? a young worker dropped a tray of cups, the noise startling Michael out of his thoughts. He watched as Leroy hurried over to help clean up the mess, patting the embarrassed teen on the shoulder with a kind smile. "Don't worry about it, Jaden. Happens to everybody," Leroy said, his voice carrying across the restaurant. That voice, deeper now, but with the same gentle strength Michael remembered. Leroy had always been kind, even when the other kids weren't. Michael's hand tightened around his soda cup. He should go say hello. Just walk up to the counter and call out to him. But what would he say after all these years? "Hey, remember me? The kid you used to play basketball with who became famous while you ended up here?" No, he couldn't do that to Leroy. Not here, not with other customers watching, and Leroy's co-workers listening. His old friend deserved better than that. Michael noticed Leroy limping slightly as he walked back to the grill. Just a small hitch in his step, but Michael's trained eye caught it immediately. An old injury? Arthritis? The result of years on his feet? The restaurant's overhead lights reflected off Leroy's name tag, making it shine momentarily. Michael's chest tightened with sudden emotion. This man had believed in him when nobody else did, had seen something special in the skinny kid who couldn't even make his high school varsity team at first. "You got heart, Mike," Leroy used to tell him. "That's what counts. All the skill in the world don't mean nothing without heart." Michael finished his meal slowly, memories washing over him like waves. The countless hours they'd spent on the cracked concrete court near Leroy's house. The way Leroy had shared his precious basketball, a real leather one his dad had saved up to buy him. The secret handshake they'd invented that summer when Michael was 11. Customers came and went as the evening wore on. Michael ordered another drink just to have a reason to stay. He watched as Leroy checked his watch, said something to a coworker, and disappeared into the back. A few minutes later, he emerged without his McDonald's cap and apron, clocking out for the night. Michael slumped lower in his booth as Leroy headed for the door, not ready to be recognized. Through the window, he watched his childhood friend walk to an old blue sedan in the corner of the parking lot. Leroy stood straighter once outside, stretching his back before getting into his car. Long after the blue sedan had disappeared down the street, Michael remained in his booth, staring at nothing, his food cold and forgotten. He knew he wouldn't be able to sleep tonight. Not after seeing Leroy. Not after all the memories that had come flooding back. Not with all the questions swirling in his mind. Michael Jordan, 6-time NBA champion, billionaire businessman, global icon, sat alone in a McDonald's booth in his hometown, feeling like that uncertain 13-year-old boy again. The boy who had lost his best friend without warning. The boy who had channeled all that confusion and hurt into becoming the greatest basketball player the world had ever seen. Tomorrow, Michael decided. Tomorrow he would come back. Tomorrow he would talk to Leroy Wilson. Sleep didn't come easy for Michael that night. He tossed and turned in his hotel bed, memories playing in his mind like an old movie. Michael at 10 years old, skinny arms and legs, all knees and elbows, a basketball too big for his hands. It was the summer of 1973 when Michael first met Leroy Wilson. Michael had just moved to a new neighborhood in Wilmington, and he didn't know anyone yet. His brothers were older and didn't want their little brother tagging along. On his third day there, Michael wandered to the local basketball court. A group of boys were playing, their shouts and laughter filling the hot summer air. Michael stood on the sidelines, too shy to ask if he could join. One boy stood out from the rest, tall for his age, with quick feet and hands that seemed to control the basketball like magic. He could dribble around the other boys as if they were standing still. When the game ended, that boy noticed Michael watching. Instead of ignoring him like the others, he jogged over, basketball tucked under his arm. "Enter to an I use. Play?" he asked, his smile wide and friendly. Michael shrugged. "A little," he mumbled. "I'm Leroy Wilson," the boy said, extending his hand. "Michael Jordan," he replied, shaking Leroy's hand. "Want me to show you some moves?" Leroy asked. That was the beginning. Every day that summer, Michael would rush through his chores so he could meet Leroy at the court. Leroy was 12 then, 2 years older than Michael, and he knew so much about basketball. "You gotta be quick like water, Mike," Leroy would say, demonstrating a crossover dribble. Water flows around whatever tries to block it. That's how you gotta be with defenders. Michael tried to copy Leroy's moves, but his coordination wasn't there yet. He'd trip over his own feet or lose control of the ball. But Leroy never laughed at him. "You'll get it," Leroy would say. "Just keep practicing. You got good instincts." The memory shifted to a day when it rained, and they couldn't play outside. Leroy had invited Michael to his house. It was smaller than Michael's, with furniture that had seen better days, but it was clean and warm, and Mrs. Wilson had made lemonade. For them, they sat on the floor of Leroy's bedroom, a basketball magazine open between them. "That's Dr. J," Leroy said, pointing to a picture of Julius Erving soaring through the air for a dunk. "Man can fly." "I want to fly like that someday," Michael said. Leroy looked at him seriously. "You will. I can see it." Michael smiled at the memory. Leroy had believed in him before anyone else did, before Michael even believed in himself. Another memory surfaced. The day Leroy got his new basketball. His family didn't have much money, but Leroy's dad had saved up to buy him a real leather basketball for his 13th birthday. "Feel it, Mike," Leroy had said, holding it out. "Real leather, like the pros use." Michael remembered the smooth feel of it, the perfect weight, the clean smell of new leather. "We're gonna share it," Leroy announced. "It's our basketball now." Michael had been speechless. It was the nicest thing anyone outside his family had ever done for him. They had made a pact that day, sitting under the old oak tree near the court. Leroy had pulled out a piece of notebook paper and written on it with a pencil. "We, Leroy Wilson and Michael Jordan, promise to practice every day and make it to the NBA someday." They both signed it, and Leroy folded it carefully and gave it to Michael. "You keep it," he said, "so you don't forget." Michael never forgot. He still had that piece of paper, yellowed with age but safely preserved in a frame in his office. The memories continued to flow. The time some older boys from another neighborhood came to their court and tried to bully Michael. "Look at skinny legs. Bet he can't even dunk on a kid's basket," one of them had taunted. Before Michael could respond, Leroy stepped between them. "Leave him alone," he said, his voice steady. The older boy shoved Leroy, and Leroy shoved back. It turned into a scuffle, and Leroy ended up with a black eye. But the older boys left. "Why'd you do that?" Michael asked later as they sat on the curb, Leroy holding a cold soda can to his eye. "Nobody messes with my little brother," Leroy said simply, though they weren't related by blood. Michael remembered countless evenings shooting hoops until the streetlights came on, Leroy patiently showing him how to position his feet, how to follow through on his shot, how to fake left and drive right. "It's all about practice, Mike," Leroy would say. "Talent only gets you so far. It's the work you put in when nobody's watching that makes you great." Michael took those words to heart. Even after Leroy disappeared, he kept practicing. Early mornings, before school, late nights after everyone else had gone home. Rain or shine, tired or sick, happy or sad, Michael worked on his game. Sometimes when he was practicing alone, he'd imagine Leroy was still there, offering tips and encouragement. "Bend your knees more on that jump shot, Mike. Good defense starts with your feet, not your hands. You gotta want it more than the other guy." Another memory came to him. The summer before Michael started high school. He and Leroy had been practicing their free throws as the sun set, turning the sky pink and orange. "You're getting real good." "Mike," Leroy said, pride in his voice. "Better than me now." "No way," Michael protested. "You still beat me one-on-one." "Not for long," Leroy predicted. "You got something special. I can see it." "We'll both make it to the NBA," Michael insisted. "Just like we promised." Leroy got quiet then, bouncing the basketball slowly. "Yeah," he said finally. "Just like we promised." 2 weeks later, Leroy was gone. Michael remembered knocking on the Wilsons' door, confused when a stranger answered. "They moved out yesterday," the man said. "Heading to Georgia, I heard. Something about a sick grandmother." Michael had stood there, stunned. No goodbye, no phone number, no address. His best friend had vanished from his life without a word. That night, Michael took their basketball pack and hid it in his drawer. He cried himself to sleep, feeling betrayed and abandoned. But the next morning, he got up and went to the court. Alone. "I'll keep our promise, Leroy," he whispered as he practiced his jump shot. "For both of us." And he did. He made the high school team, then got a scholarship to North Carolina. Then the NBA draft. Championships. Fame. Fortune. Through it all, he kept the pact tucked away, a reminder of where he started and who believed in him first. Michael's hotel room phone rang, pulling him from his memories. It was his assistant, reminding him about his meetings tomorrow. "I need to reschedule," Michael said. "Something's come up, something important." Tomorrow, he would see Leroy again, and this time, he wouldn't just watch from across the room. The next morning, Michael woke up early. His meetings were rescheduled, his day cleared. He felt nervous, like before a big game. What would he say to Leroy after all these years? As he showered and dressed, Michael's mind drifted back to that painful time when Leroy disappeared from his life. August 1976. Michael was 13 years old and excited to start 8th grade. He and Leroy had big plans for the school year. Leroy would be starting high school, but they'd still meet at the court every day after school. "Coach Harrison is going to see what you can do this year," Leroy had told him just days before. "You're ready for the team now." But when Michael went to the court that Tuesday afternoon, Leroy wasn't there. Unusual, but not worrying. Maybe he was sick or had to help his mom with something. The next day, still no Leroy. And the next. By Friday, Michael was worried. He still remembered the heavy feeling in his stomach as he walked to Leroy's house, the leather basketball they shared tucked under his arm. The front yard, usually neat despite the patchy grass, looked different, empty. No chairs on the porch, no sounds from inside. Michael knocked anyway. Once, twice, 3 times. No answer. The door of the next house opened, and a middle-aged man stepped out. "They're gone, kid," he called to Michael. "Moved out 2 days ago." "Moved?" Michael repeated, not understanding. "Where?" "Georgia, I think. Something about the grandmother being sick. Left in a hurry." Michael stood on that empty porch for what felt like hours, clutching the basketball, trying to make sense of it. Why wouldn't Leroy tell him? They talked about everything. They were best friends. Brothers, Leroy had said. He would have said goodbye. Michael whispered to himself, "He would have told me." But he hadn't. Michael walked home in a daze, the basketball feeling heavier with each step. His mother noticed something was wrong as soon as he walked in. "What's the matter, baby?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "Leroy's gone," Michael said, his voice cracking. They moved away. His mother's face softened with sympathy. "Oh, Michael, I'm so sorry." "He didn't even say goodbye, Mom." "Why? Wouldn't he say goodbye?" She pulled him into a hug, letting him cry against her shoulder. Michael wasn't a crier, even then, but this hurt worse than any scraped knee or lost game. "Sometimes people have to leave suddenly," she said gently. "It doesn't mean he didn't care about you." But it felt like that to Michael. It felt like betrayal. That night, he took the piece of paper with their NBA pact and folded it into a small square. He placed it in his desk drawer, buried under notebooks and pencils. Out of sight, but never truly out of mind. The next week, school started. Michael went through the motions, quiet and withdrawn. His friends noticed, but he brushed off their questions. How could he explain that the person who believed in him most had left without a word? The basketball court became his refuge. While other kids his age were going to movies or hanging out at the mall, Michael was practicing. Jump shots, free throws, dribbling drills. Hour after hour, day after day. His father noticed his new intensity. "What's driving you so hard, son?" he asked one evening as Michael was finally coming home after dark. "I made a promise," Michael said simply. His father didn't ask for more, just nodded with understanding. Michael tried to find Leroy. He asked his mother to call information for Wilson families in Georgia. But there were too many, and they didn't have a specific town to narrow it down. This was long before the internet, before cell phones and social media made people easy to find. Once, about a year later, Michael thought he saw Leroy at a regional basketball tournament. A tall boy with the same fluid movement. Michael's heart raced as he pushed through the crowd. But when the boy turned around, it wasn't Leroy. Just someone with a similar build and haircut. The disappointment was crushing. Time passed. Michael made the high school team, just as Leroy had predicted. He wasn't a star yet, but his hard work was paying off. Every achievement felt bittersweet. He wished Leroy could see him play, could see that he was keeping their promise. By his junior year, Michael's game had transformed. The hours of solitary practice, fueled partly by the pain of Leroy's absence, had molded him into an exceptional player. He earned a spot on the varsity team and quickly became its standout performer. College. Scouts started showing up at his games. North Carolina, Duke, Syracuse, all interested in the high-flying guard from Wilmington. When Michael signed with North Carolina, local newspapers ran stories about the hometown boy making good. He kept looking for Leroy's name in box scores. From Georgia high schools, thinking surely his friend would be making headlines too. But he never found him. The NBA draft in 1984 was the fulfillment of their shared dream. As Michael heard his name called by the Chicago Bulls, part of him was still that 13-year-old boy, wondering if Leroy was watching somewhere, if he remembered their pact. Throughout his career, as the championships and MVP awards piled up, Michael occasionally tried to find information about Leroy. He hired people to search records in Georgia, to track down the Wilsons, but it was as if they had vanished completely. Fame made it harder. Michael couldn't just knock on doors anymore or make calls himself. Everything had to go through layers of staff and security. And as his stardom grew, the memory of Leroy, while never forgotten, became something he revisited. Less often. Life moved on. Marriage, children, business ventures, baseball, comebacks, retirement. The years flew by. Michael became more than a basketball player. He became an icon, a brand, a billionaire. But sometimes, in quiet moments, he still thought about the boy who first saw his potential, who taught him to be quick like water, who shared his precious basketball and stood up to bullies for him. The friend who believed Michael would fly before Michael had wings. As Michael finished dressing, he looked at his reflection in the hotel mirror. No longer the skinny kid from the neighborhood courts. No longer the high-flying superstar either. Now, a business titan, a team owner, a legend. He reached for his phone and canceled his driver. He'd drive himself to McDonald's today. This was personal. This was about Michael and Leroy, not Michael Jordan, the celebrity. 47 years, Michael said to his reflection. Time to find out what happened to you, my friend. Michael arrived at the McDonald's just after the lunch rush. He parked his SUV at the far end of the lot, away from other cars. For a moment, he sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, gathering his courage. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to himself. "I've hit game-winning shots with millions watching. I can talk to an old friend." But this felt different. More important somehow. Michael pulled his baseball cap low and entered the restaurant. Fewer customers than yesterday, mostly elderly people and mothers with young children. Michael scanned the kitchen area. No sign of Leroy. His heart sank. Maybe Leroy wasn't working today. Maybe yesterday had been a one-time thing. Then the swinging door to the back room opened, and Leroy emerged, tying an apron around his waist. Michael quickly found a booth and sat with his back to the counter, not ready to be seen yet. He ordered a coffee from a young server, then settled in to watch Leroy work. From this angle, he could observe without being obvious. Leroy moved differently than the younger staff, more deliberate. Michael noticed the slight limp again. Not pronounced, but definitely there. Despite it, Leroy worked efficiently, his hands, sure and practiced, as he assembled burgers and wrapped them. A teenager working beside Leroy dropped a spatula. The clatter made several customers look up. The boy's face flushed with embarrassment. "Don't sweat it, Marcus," Michael heard Leroy say. "First week's always tough. You're doing fine." The kindness in his voice was so familiar, the same tone he'd used when Michael fumbled a basketball or missed an easy shot all those years ago. Leroy picked up the spatula and handed it to the teen with a smile. The boy visibly relaxed. "That's Leroy for you," said a voice. Michael looked up to see his server standing by his table with a coffee pot. "Nicest man you'll ever meet. Been training all the new kids for years." "He's worked here a long time?" Michael asked. 5 years at this location," she said, refilling his cup, though it was still half full. "Came from another McDonald's in Fayetteville before that. The manager says he's the hardest worker here. Never calls in sick. Never complains about the schedule." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Between you and me, he's too good for this place. Man's got wisdom, you know. Talks to me about my college classes. Remembers every detail about my kids. Most people just see an old man flipping burgers, but Mr. Wilson's special." Michael nodded, emotion tightening his throat. "Sounds like it." The server straightened up. "Anyway, sorry to talk your ear off. Let me know if you need anything else." As she walked away, Michael continued watching Leroy. His old friend was showing the new employee how to properly arrange the sandwich ingredients. Patient, thorough, never condescending. 47 years had passed, but Leroy's character hadn't changed. Still teaching, still encouraging, still kind. A group of teenagers came in, loud and rowdy. One of them knocked over a chair. Another started, throwing French fries at his friend. The manager, A harried-looking woman in her 30s hurried from behind the counter. "Hey, cut that out or leave," she said sharply. The teens ignored her, laughing. One boy made a mocking face behind her back. Leroy approached them, wiping his hands on a towel. "Afternoon, gentlemen," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We're happy to have you here, but I need you to respect our restaurant and the other customers." Something in his tone made the teens pause. The tallest boy looked like he might argue, but Leroy held his gaze steadily. "My mistake," the boy finally said, picking up the chair. "Sorry about that," Leroy nodded. "Appreciate it. You boys enjoy your meal." As he walked back to the kitchen, Michael noticed Leroy wince slightly, rubbing his lower back. "Bad back?" Michael heard the manager ask him. "Just stiff today," Leroy replied. "Nothing serious." "You've been on your feet for 6 hours, Leroy. Take your break soon, okay?" Leroy nodded, but Michael could tell he had no intention of stopping. The lunch rush might be over, but the restaurant was still busy enough to need all hands working. Michael sipped his coffee slowly, thinking about the different paths their lives had taken. While he had been winning championships, building a business empire, and traveling the world in private jets, what had Leroy been doing? Had he ever married? Did he have children? What dreams had he pursued or abandoned? The unfairness of it struck Michael hard. They had started at the same place. Leroy had been the better player back then, the one who seemed destined for greatness. How had their roads diverged so dramatically? 2 hours passed. Michael ordered lunch he didn't want, just to have a reason to stay. He answered emails on his phone, glancing up regularly to check on Leroy. Mid-afternoon, the restaurant grew quiet. Only a handful of customers remained. Leroy disappeared into the back, returning without his apron. Break time, finally. Michael watched as Leroy filled a cup with water and sat heavily at a table in the corner. He pulled out a worn paperback book and began reading, occasionally rubbing his knee. Now was the time. Michael should walk over, say hello. But doubt crept in. What if Leroy didn't remember him? Worse, what if he did remember, but didn't want to talk about the past? What if he resented Michael's success? Before Michael could decide, a school bus pulled up outside. Within minutes, the restaurant filled with middle school students, loud and hungry after a field trip. Leroy glanced at his watch, sighed, put away his book, and stood up. Break over. He limped back to the kitchen, moving a little slower now, but still determined. Michael watched as he put his apron back on and returned to the grill, immediately, jumping in to help with the sudden rush of orders. The manager touched Leroy's arm. "You've got 20 minutes left on your break, Leroy. I can handle this." Leroy shook his head. "These kids are hungry, and they've got places to be." "I'm fine, Darlene." Michael recognized that stubborn tone. Leroy had always been that way, putting others first, never admitting when he was tired or hurting. An hour later, the school group departed, leaving behind scattered trays and crumpled napkins. The staff hurried to clean up. Leroy moved methodically from table to table, wiping surfaces and straightening chairs. As the afternoon wore on, Michael realized he'd spent the entire day watching his old friend work. He'd learned a lot without exchanging a single word with Leroy. He'd seen his kindness with the young employee, his firm but respectful handling of the rowdy teens, his willingness to cut his break short to help during a rush. Leroy Wilson was still the person Michael remembered, just older, maybe a little more weary, and working a job that didn't begin to reflect his worth. When Leroy finally clocked out at 6 p.m., Michael followed him to the parking lot, keeping a distance. He watched as Leroy walked to the same old blue sedan, moving with that slight limp. He saw how Leroy paused before getting in, stretching his back carefully. "Tomorrow," Michael promised himself. "Tomorrow, I'll talk to him." But tonight, he had some research to do. He needed to learn everything he could about Leroy Wilson's life. What had happened to his old friend in the decades since that summer when Michael was 13? As Michael drove back to his hotel, his mind was already forming a plan. Back at his hotel, Michael made some calls. First to his assistant in Chicago. "I need information on a Leroy Wilson, currently living in Wilmington, North Carolina. Probably in his 60s now. Works at McDonald's on Market Street." "What kind of information, sir?" his assistant asked. "Everything. Current address, family status, employment history, financial situation," Michael replied. "Be discreet." His next call was to his lawyer. He needed to know what options he had for helping someone without creating complications or embarrassment. By the next morning, Michael had a basic picture of Leroy's life. Not a complete one, but enough to know that his friend had struggled. Divorced once, widowed once, 4 children, a grandson in the military, an address in a modest apartment complex on the outskirts of town, no property ownership, no significant assets. Michael waited until evening to return to the McDonald's. The dinner rush would be ending, and Leroy's shift would be wrapping up, according to the schedule Michael had memorized from watching him yesterday. The restaurant was quiet when Michael arrived at 8:30 p.m. Only a few customers lingered at tables. Michael spotted Leroy immediately, mopping the floor near the drink station. His movements were slower than earlier in the day, fatigue evident in the slump of his shoulders. Michael took a deep breath and removed his baseball cap. No more hiding. He walked directly to where Leroy was working. "Excuse me," he said. Leroy looked up, ready to step aside with his mop. His eyes met Michael's, and for a moment, there was no recognition. Then his expression changed. Surprise, disbelief, and something else Michael couldn't quite name. "Leroy Wilson," Michael said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "It's me, Michael Jordan." Leroy's hands tightened on the mop handle. He stared at Michael for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face. "I know who you are, Mike," he said softly. "I recognized you yesterday." It was Michael's turn to be surprised. "You knew it was me? Why didn't you say anything?" Leroy's smile turned sad. "What was I supposed to say? Hey, world-famous billionaire. Remember me? The guy flipping burgers at McDonald's? We used to play basketball together when we were kids." Fürtiki words stung, but Michael understood. "I would have been happy to hear from you, Leroy." Leroy glanced around, suddenly aware that other employees and a few customers were watching with interest. "My shift ends in 15 minutes, he said. "If you want to wait." Michael nodded. "I'll wait." He found a table near the door and sat down. 15 minutes. It felt like hours. He watched as Leroy finished mopping, put the cleaning supplies away, and went to the back room. When Leroy emerged, he had changed out of his uniform into jeans and a faded blue button-down shirt. Michael stood as Leroy approached his table. For a moment, they just looked at each other, taking in the changes time had wrought. Then, without a word, they embraced. A hard, tight hug between men who had once been as close as brothers. When they pulled apart, Michael was surprised to see tears in Leroy's eyes. He felt moisture in his own. "It's been a long time," Leroy said, his voice rough with emotion. "Too long," Michael agreed. "Is there somewhere we can talk?" They ended up at a small diner a few blocks away. The place was nearly empty, and the waitress seated them in a corner booth, away from the few other diners. She did a double take when she saw Michael, but professionally kept her excitement in check. "Just coffee for now, please," Michael told her, and Leroy nodded in agreement. When she left, an awkward silence fell between them. So many years, so many questions. Where to begin? "You have a limp," Michael said finally. "Old basketball injury?" Leroy smiled slightly. "Car accident, about 10 years ago. Messed up my knee pretty bad. Never healed, right?" He looked at Michael. "You're looking good, Mike. The years have been kind to you." "I've been lucky," Michael said. "Luck had nothing to do with it," Leroy countered. "You worked for everything you got. I used to watch your games whenever I could. Seeing you fly, man, it was something else. You kept our promise." "I kept the pact," Michael said. "I still have it, you know? That piece of paper we signed." Leroy's eyes widened. "You're kidding. After all these years?" Michael nodded. "It meant a lot to me." The waitress brought their coffee and left them alone again. "Why did you leave, Leroy?" Michael asked, the question that had haunted him for decades finally out in the open. "Why didn't you say goodbye?" Leroy's expression grew serious. He stared into his coffee cup for a long moment. "It wasn't my choice, Mike. My grandmother really was sick. That part was true. But there was more to it." He sighed. "It's a long story, and not a happy one." "I've got time," Michael said simply. For the next hour, they talked. Leroy explained how his family had been forced to move suddenly, how financial struggles and family obligations had derailed his basketball dreams, how life had dealt him one setback after another. Marriage, children, jobs gained and lost, health, problems, heartbreaks. "My wife died from cancer 10 years ago," Leroy said. "The same year as the car accident. Worst year of my life." "I'm sorry," Michael said, feeling the inadequacy of the words. Leroy shrugged. "Life happens how it happens. My kids turned out good, and that's what matters. My oldest boy joined the Marines right out of high school, got injured in Afghanistan, lives with my sister now. And the others? 2 daughters, both doing okay. One's a teacher in Charlotte. The other works for the post office here in town. The youngest boy is in community college. Smart kid. Wants to be an accountant." Pride shone in Leroy's eyes when he talked about his children. Despite everything, he had raised a family he was proud of. "What about you?" Leroy asked. "I know the basketball stuff from TV, and the shoes and all that. But you got kids, right? How's that going?" It was Michael's turn to talk about his life, his marriages, his children, his business ventures, his baseball career, his NBA team ownership. Leroy listened intently, asking thoughtful questions. "Sounds like you've had a good life, Mike," he said when Michael finished. "I have," Michael agreed. "But something was always missing. I never stopped wondering what happened to you." Their coffee cups were empty now, the diner preparing to close. They had barely scratched the surface of 47 years of separate lives. "We should do this again," Michael said as they walked to the parking lot. "Tomorrow?" Leroy hesitated. "I work a double shift tomorrow. Sunday I'm off, though." "Sunday, then," Michael said firmly. "I'll pick you up. Just tell me where." They exchanged phone numbers, and Michael programmed Leroy's address into his phone. "It was good seeing you, Mike," Leroy said as they prepared to part. "Really good." Michael watched as Leroy drove away in his old blue sedan, feeling both satisfied and unsettled. He had found his friend, but now what? What could he possibly do to make up for the vastly different paths their lives had taken? Sunday morning arrived with a gentle rain falling over Wilmington. Michael drove his rental SUV through neighborhoods he barely recognized. The city had changed so much since his childhood. He found Leroy's apartment building easily enough. A two-story complex with peeling paint and rusted railings. The kind of place where people lived because they had to, not because they wanted. Leroy was waiting outside under the small awning, dressed in clean jeans and a button-down shirt that had seen better days. He smiled when he saw Michael's car and hurried over, hunching against the rain. "Morning," Leroy said as he climbed in. "Nice ride." "Just a rental," Michael replied. "Thought we could get breakfast somewhere quiet and talk more." Leroy nodded. "Sounds good. There's a place called Denny's about 10 minutes from here. Food's decent, and they don't get too busy on Sunday mornings." "Denny's it is," Michael said, hiding his surprise. He'd been thinking of a more upscale restaurant, but this wasn't about what he wanted. This was about making Leroy comfortable. At the restaurant, they were seated in a corner booth, away from other diners. A few people glanced their way, recognizing Michael despite his casual clothes and baseball cap, but no one approached them. After they ordered coffee and pancakes for Leroy, an egg white omelet for Michael, they settled into conversation more easily than before. The initial shock of reunion was behind them. "You said your wife died from cancer," Michael began gently. "I'm sorry. That must have been incredibly hard." Leroy's face softened with memory. "Sandra was something special. We were married for 27 years. She got sick fast. Pancreatic cancer. From diagnosis to..." His voice broke slightly. "To the end was just 8 months." "I can't imagine," Michael said, and meant it. Despite his father's murder and other losses, he'd never experienced the slow pain of watching someone he loved die from illness. "Medical bills took everything," Leroy continued after a moment. "We had some insurance, but not enough. Had to sell our house, cash in what little retirement we had." He stirred his coffee absently. "That was around the same time as my car accident. I was driving home from the hospital late one night, fell asleep at the wheel. Woke up in the same hospital as Sandra, with a busted knee and 3 broken ribs." "That's why you limp," Michael said. Leroy nodded. "Never had the money for the surgery that might have fixed it properly. By the time I had insurance again, the doctors said it was too late, that I'd have to live with it." Their food arrived, bringing a brief pause to the conversation. Michael watched as Leroy carefully poured syrup over his pancakes, measuring the flow as if it were a precious resource. "Tell me about your kids," Michael prompted, wanting to move to a happier subject. Leroy's face brightened immediately. "My oldest, Jerome, joined the Marines right after high school. Smart boy, but restless, you know? He did 2 tours in Afghanistan before an IED got him, lost his right leg below the knee." "I'm sorry," Michael said, the words feeling inadequate. "He's doing okay now," Leroy said with quiet pride. "Got a prosthetic. Lives with my sister Tanya since I don't have room in my place, working as a counselor for other vets." He pulled out his wallet and showed Michael a photo of a handsome young man in military dress uniform. "My girls are Letitia and Denise. Letitia's the teacher, 3rd grade. Got her degree while working nights at a grocery store. Denise works for the post office, has a little boy named Marcus. Smart as a whip, that one." Another photo emerged. 2 young women with Leroy's same warm smile. Youngest is Tyler. He's 19, studying accounting at the community college. Works part-time at the library. Wants to be a CPA someday. A final photo showed a serious-looking young man with glasses, holding a textbook. "They all sound amazing," Michael said sincerely. "You've done a great job, Leroy." Leroy shrugged. but his eyes shone with pride. "They're good kids. We didn't have much, but they never lacked for love." Sandra made sure of that, and after she was gone, I did my best to keep her spirit alive in our home. Do they live nearby? Besides Jerome, I mean. Letitia's in Charlotte. Comes home when she can. Denise has an apartment across town with Marcus. Tyler lives with me when he's not at school. My place is small, but we make it work. As they ate, Leroy shared more about his life after leaving Wilmington as a boy. His family had indeed moved to Georgia to care for his grandmother, who died just 6 months later. But by then, his father had found steady work in a factory there, so they stayed. Leroy played basketball in high school, was even scouted by a few small colleges. But his family couldn't afford the expenses that scholarships didn't cover, so he went to work instead. Marriage came at 20, children soon after. "Life happens fast, Mike," he said. "One day you're a kid with dreams. The key, next, you're responsible for other people's lives. You make the best choices you can with what you have." "Did you ever regret not pursuing basketball?" Michael asked, the question that had been on his mind. Leroy considered this, then shook his head. "Not regret, exactly. Sometimes I wondered what might have been, especially when I watched you play." He smiled. "But my kids were worth every sacrifice. I'd do it all again for them." As they finished breakfast, Michael asked about the McDonald's job. "Been there 5 years," Leroy explained. "Before that, I worked at another one in Fayetteville for 3 years. Before that, I was a janitor at an elementary school, but budget cuts eliminated my position. I've done all kinds of work: construction, warehouse, delivery driver. Never made much, but always enough to keep food on the table." The quiet dignity in Leroy's voice moved Michael deeply. Here was a man who had faced one setback after another, yet never became bitter or stopped caring for others. "What about you, Mike?" Leroy asked suddenly. "You've got all the money and fame anybody could want. Are you happy?" The directness of the question caught Michael off guard. Was he happy? He had success, wealth, children he loved, respect from, millions. But happiness? "Most days," he answered honestly. "I've been blessed in many ways. But there's been emptiness too. Moments when none of it seemed to matter much." Leroy nodded as if he understood perfectly. "Life's never simple, is it? Not for anybody." As they left the restaurant, the rain had stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds, making the wet pavement gleam. "Where to now?" Leroy asked. "How about showing me around? I'd like to see your Wilmington, the places that matter to you." For the next few hours, they drove through the city, Leroy pointing out places from his current life. The park where he sometimes read books on his days off. The community center where his grandson played basketball. The church he attended every Sunday evening. What struck Michael most was how Leroy seemed to know everyone. At each stop, people greeted him with genuine warmth. A homeless man who Leroy regularly brought coffee to. A young mother whose car Leroy had helped fix. The pastor who spoke of Leroy's quiet generosity, despite his limited means. By the time Michael dropped Leroy back at his apartment building, he had made his decision. He knew exactly what he wanted to do for his old friend. "Can I see you again? Tomorrow?" Michael asked. "I work noon to close," Leroy replied. "Before that, then. There's something I want to talk to you about." Leroy gave him a curious look but nodded. "I'm up by 6. Come by any time after that." As Michael drove back to his hotel, his mind was racing with plans, phone calls to make, arrangements to set in motion. Leroy had given him so much when they were boys. Now it was Michael's turn to give back. Michael spent Sunday night in his hotel room making calls. First to his business manager in Chicago. "Tom, I need you to free up $5 million from my personal account," Michael said, without preamble. "$5 million?" Tom repeated. "May I ask what for?" "A project here in Wilmington. I'll explain everything later, but I need this to move fast, and I need complete discretion." "Of course, Mr. Jordan. I'll have the funds ready by tomorrow afternoon." Next, Michael called his lawyer to discuss creating a trust and employment contracts. Then he reached out to a real estate agent he knew in Wilmington. "Diane, it's Michael Jordan. I need a commercial property, preferably in the downtown area or near the schools. Something that could be converted into a community center." "That's an interesting request," Diane said. "Any specific size requirements?" "Large enough for at least 2 basketball courts, classrooms, offices, a kitchen. And I need to see properties tomorrow." By Monday morning, Michael had a list of potential properties to view and meetings scheduled with local business owners and community leaders. Before all that, though, he was due at Leroy's apartment. He arrived just after 7, bearing coffee and a bag of fresh bagels. Leroy answered the door looking surprised at the breakfast offering. "You didn't have to bring anything," he said, but accepted the food gratefully. Leroy's apartment was small and neat. Old furniture, carefully maintained, a few family photos on the walls, a shelf of well-worn books. Nothing fancy, but clean and orderly. They sat at a small table in the kitchen area. Michael noticed how Leroy's gaze kept drifting to a framed photo of a smiling woman, Sandra, his late wife. "I have some questions for you," Michael said after they'd eaten. "Just curious about some things." Leroy nodded. "Ask away. If you could do anything now, any job, any dream, what would it be?" Leroy looked surprised by the question. He thought for a moment before answering. "Honestly, I've always wanted to work with kids. Teaching basketball, sure, but more than that. Giving them guidance, support. The kind of thing I tried to do for you back in the day." He smiled at the memory. "There are a lot of kids in this city who need someone to believe in them." Michael nodded. This confirmed what he'd suspected. "What stopped you from doing that?" he asked. Leroy shrugged. "Life, bills, need for steady income. Those kinds of jobs don't pay much if they pay at all. And setting up something on my own was never financially possible." "What if money wasn't an issue?" Leroy gave him a curious look. "What are you getting at, Mike?" "Just a hypothetical," Michael said. "If you could design your perfect job working with kids, what would it look like?" Leroy leaned back in his chair, considering. "I'd create a place where kids could come after school. Somewhere safe with basketball courts, sure, but also tutoring, computers, healthy meals. Some kids don't get dinner if they don't make it themselves, you know? I'd want to help with that." His eyes had lit up as he spoke, showing a passion Michael hadn't seen before. "Most importantly, I'd want to be a mentor," Leroy continued. "Someone who listens, who cares about their futures, someone who sees their potential even when they can't see it themselves." "Like you did for me," Michael thought. "Sometimes I think about opening a youth center," Leroy said softly. "Giving kids a safe place to play and dream. Silly idea at my age, I guess." "It's not silly at all," Michael said firmly. "It's a great idea." They talked for another hour, Michael asking more questions about Leroy's family, his interests, his dreams for his children and grandson. He learned that Jerome, Leroy's injured son, had studied sports management before joining the military. Letitia, the teacher, had minored in social work. Tyler, the youngest, was good with numbers and computers by the time Michael left, promising to call Leroy later in the week. His plan had fully formed in his mind. The rest of the day was a whirlwind of activity. Michael viewed 6 properties with the real estate agent, finally settling on a vacant former department store in downtown Wilmington. 3 stories, 30,000 square feet. Solid structure, but in need of renovation. "I'll take it," he told Diane. "Full asking price, cash deal, as soon as possible." Next came meetings with contractors, architects, and suppliers. Michael was clear about his timeline. He wanted renovations completed within 6 months. Money was no object. Speed and quality were the priorities. "We'll need basketball courts, educational spaces, a commercial kitchen, offices, meeting rooms," Michael explained to the wide-eyed architect. "I want the best equipment, the best facilities. This needs to be something special." In between meetings, Michael drove to the old neighborhood where he and Leroy had played as boys. The basketball court was still there, though the hoops were bent and the concrete cracked. Michael stood there for a long moment, remembering the summer days when Leroy had patiently taught him how to dribble, how to shoot, how to move on the court. "This is where it all started," he murmured to himself. That evening, Michael made more calls to former NBA players who might be willing to make appearances at the center, to educational consultants who could help design programs, to nutrition experts who could plan healthy meals for kids. He also called each of Leroy's children, having gotten their numbers from his investigator. He explained who he was and what he was planning. All were surprised but quickly embraced the idea, especially when Michael explained their potential roles. "Your father changed my life," he told each of them. "I want to give him the chance to do the same for other kids." Jerome, speaking from Leroy's sister's house, was particularly enthusiastic. "Dad's been talking about something like this for years," he said. "He volunteers at the community center whenever he can, even after long shifts at McDonald's. This would be his dream come true." By Tuesday, Michael had set everything in motion. The property purchase was underway. Renovation plans were being drawn up. Staffing plans and budgets were taking shape. Through it all, Michael kept his activities secret from Leroy. He wanted everything to be perfect before the big reveal. 6 months, he told his project manager. 6 months until opening day. What Michael was creating wasn't just a building or a program. It was a legacy, not for himself, but for the friend who had believed in him first. 3 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Michael extended his stay in Wilmington, working from his hotel suite when he needed to handle his regular business matters. Most of his time, though, was devoted to his secret project. The old department store was transforming rapidly. Walls came down. New spaces took shape. Basketball courts with gleaming hardwood floors. Computer labs with the latest equipment. A kitchen that would make a professional chef jealous. Meeting rooms and offices. Even a small medical clinic. Michael visited the site daily, making decisions on everything from floor materials to the color of the paint on the walls. He wanted it all to be perfect. He stayed in touch with Leroy, meeting him for coffee or lunch, whenever their schedules allowed. Michael was careful not to reveal his plans, instead asking subtle questions about what Leroy would consider important in a youth center. Each answer helped refine the project. "Kids need space to move," Leroy told him during one of their conversations, "but they also need quiet places to study, to think. Some of these kids don't have that at home." Michael added a library space with comfortable seating the next day. "Healthy food matters," Leroy said another time. "Many of these kids don't get proper nutrition. Fast food's cheap, but it's not what growing bodies need." Michael hired a nutritionist, to design meal programs and train kitchen staff. Through it all, Leroy remained unaware of what was happening just a mile from his apartment. Michael made sure construction vehicles only came and went at times when Leroy would be at work, and the building's exterior remained unchanged for now, with work focusing on the interior. Michael also spent time getting to know Leroy's children. Jerome, despite his prosthetic leg, had a sharp mind for organizational matters. Letitia's experience in education proved invaluable for designing learning programs. Denise knew the community well and suggested local vendors and suppliers. Even young Tyler contributed, designing a computer tracking system for attendance and program participation. The family embraced the secret, excited to be part of something that would honor their father's lifelong dream. They shared stories about Leroy that confirmed what Michael already knew. His old friend had always put others first, even when it cost him dearly. "Dad worked 2 jobs when I was in college," Letitia told Michael. "He never complained, even though I know he was exhausted. He just wanted me to have the chances he didn't get." "He taught all of us to play basketball," Jerome added. "Not because he wanted us to be stars, but because he said it built character. Teamwork, discipline, perseverance. Those were the lessons he cared about." As opening day approached, Michael faced a decision. The center needed a name. He considered naming it after Leroy, but somehow that didn't feel right. Leroy wasn't the kind of man who sought recognition. The answer came to Michael one evening as he looked through old photos from his childhood. There was one of him and Leroy, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. 2 kids with dreams, standing together. "That's it," Michael murmured. Wilson and Jordan Youth Center. Equal partners, just as they had been as boys. Finally, 3 weeks after Michael's first meeting with the real estate agent, everything was ready. The renovation was complete. Staff had been hired and trained. Programs were designed. All that remained was to show Leroy what Michael had created for him. What he had created because of him. Michael called Leroy on a Friday evening. "Are you free tomorrow morning?" he asked. "There's something I'd like to show you." "Sure," Leroy replied, sounding curious. "I don't start work until noon." "Great. I'll pick you up at 9. Michael hardly slept that night, nervous energy keeping him awake. Would Leroy approve? Would he accept this gift in the spirit it was intended? Or would he see it as charity, as Michael showing off his wealth? The next morning was bright and clear. A perfect April day. Michael arrived at Leroy's apartment building. Precisely at 9. Leroy was waiting outside, dressed in his usual jeans and button-down shirt. "Morning," Leroy said as he climbed into the car. "Where are we going? That's got you looking so serious." "You'll see," Michael replied with a small smile. They drove in comfortable silence to downtown Wilmington. Michael parked in front of the old department store, where a group of people in business attire waited on the sidewalk. Leroy looked confused when he recognized his children among them. "What's going on, Mike?" he asked. "Why are my kids here?" "You'll see," Michael repeated, leading Leroy to the building. The storefront windows were still covered with paper, hiding the interior. A simple sign hung above the door, covered with a cloth. The gathering included the architect, the project manager, several city officials, and a few local business owners who had contributed to the project. All were smiling, excited to be part of this moment. Michael handed Leroy a key, a simple brass key on a basketball-shaped keychain. "What's this for?" Leroy asked, looking more confused by the second. "Open it up and see," Michael said, nodding toward the door. Leroy's hand trembled slightly as he inserted the key and turned it. The lock clicked, and he pushed the door open. Michael reached inside and flipped on the lights. Leroy stepped into a large, bright lobby. The walls were painted in warm colors, with motivational quotes from athletes and leaders stenciled in elegant script. Directly ahead was a reception desk with a sleek computer. To the right, large glass doors revealed a gleaming basketball court. Leroy stood frozen, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What is this place?" he whispered. Michael guided him forward. They walked through the lobby to the basketball court, where 2 full-sized hoops stood at either end. The hardwood floor shone under the lights. Bleachers lined one wall. From there, they moved to a computer lab filled with new desktops and tablets. Then to classrooms with smart boards and comfortable seating. To a game room with pool tables and video game stations. To a kitchen and dining area that could serve 100 kids at once. "This is a youth center," Michael explained as they walked. "A place where kids can come after school for sports, tutoring, meals, guidance. Everything you said you wished existed when we were growing up." They ended the tour at a door with a nameplate that read, "Leroy Wilson, Executive Director." Inside was a spacious office with a desk, comfortable chairs, and a wall of windows overlooking the basketball court. "I don't understand," Leroy said, his voice thick with emotion. "You did all this?" Michael led him back to the lobby where everyone had gathered. He reached up and pulled the cloth from the sign above the entrance. "Wilson and Jordan Youth Center," Leroy read aloud, his voice breaking. "You taught me my first crossover dribble on a cracked concrete court," Michael said softly. "You believed in me when nobody else did. This center isn't just my gift to you, Leroy. It's my way of making sure other kids have someone who believes in them too." Tears streamed down Leroy's face. "I don't know what to say, Mike." "Say you'll run it," Michael replied simply. "That's all I ask." Leroy looked around at the gathered faces, his children beaming with pride, Michael standing tall beside him, the staff and officials waiting for his response. He took a deep breath, struggling to find words. I don't know how to run something like this," he finally said, his voice soft with uncertainty. Michael put a hand on his shoulder. "That's why I've arranged for you to receive training in nonprofit management. A 6-week course at UNC Wilmington, all expenses paid. The center won't open to the public until you're ready." "But my job at McDonald's has been taken care of," Michael finished for him. "I spoke with your manager. She was sad to lose you, but understood completely. You'll receive a salary as executive director that's 3 times what you made there." Leroy shook his head in disbelief. "Mike, this is too much. I can't accept all this." "Yes, you can," Michael said firmly, "because it's not just for you. It's for the kids of Wilmington, kids like we used to be, who need someone to believe in them." Jerome stepped forward, resting his weight on his prosthetic leg. "Dad, this is what you've always wanted. A chance to make a difference, to help kids the way you helped us. And you won't be doing it alone," Letitia added. "I've accepted a position as education coordinator. I'll be moving back from Charlotte to work with you." Leroy's eyes widened. "You're giving up your teaching job?" Letitia smiled. "I'm not giving up teaching. I'm just doing it in a different way, helping more kids who really need it. And I'll be handling the administrative side," Jerome said. "Mr. Jordan has created a position for me as operations manager. Denise will run the meal program part-time," Michael explained, "and Tyler will manage the computer systems while he finishes school. It's truly a family operation, Leroy. Your family." Leroy looked at his children, saw their excitement and hope. Then he looked at Michael, his oldest friend, who had never forgotten him despite all the years and distance. "I don't know how to. Thank you," he said, his voice breaking. "Just say yes," Michael replied. Leroy straightened his shoulders, stood a little taller. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I'll run it. I'll make it everything these kids need." The small crowd broke into applause. Leroy's children surrounded him in a group hug. When they stepped back, Michael formally presented him with a document, the deed to the building, held in trust for the Wilson and Jordan Youth Center, with funding guaranteed for the next 10 years. $5 million, Michael explained, quietly. Invested to provide ongoing support. The center will never have to worry about keeping the lights on or the staff paid. Leroy couldn't speak. The magnitude of the gift was overwhelming, not just the building and the money, but the faith Michael was placing in him. As the officials and staff dispersed to enjoy the catered lunch set up in the dining area, Michael took Leroy aside. "There's one more thing I want to show you," he said, leading Leroy down a hallway to a room they hadn't visited during the tour. The door was marked simply Trophy Room. Michael opened it and ushered Leroy inside. The room was small but beautifully designed, with recessed lighting and polished wood paneling. Display cases lined the walls, most of them empty, waiting for future achievements. But one case, at the center of the room, was already filled. Inside was a worn leather basketball, the very one Leroy's father had bought him for his 13th birthday, the one he had shared with Michael all those summers ago. "Your sister had it in her attic," Michael explained, seeing Leroy's shock. "She kept it all these years, hoping someday you'd have a place for it." Next to the basketball was a framed piece of notebook paper, yellowed with age. Their childhood pact to make it to the NBA, written in pencil in childish handwriting, both their signatures at the bottom. "You really kept it," Leroy whispered, staring at the paper. "All this time, it was the first promise I ever made that really mattered to me," Michael said. "I wanted to remember where I came from and who believed in me first." Leroy touched the glass case gently, as if afraid the contents might disappear. "I never thought I'd see that basketball again." "It belongs here," Michael said, "where it can inspire other kids to dream big." They stood in silence for a moment, both lost in memories of those long-ago days on the neighborhood court. "This room will fill up over time," Michael continued, "with trophies the kids win, photos of success stories, memorabilia that matters to the community. But these two items, they're the heart of it all, where it all began." Leroy nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. When they rejoined the others, Leroy was introduced to the staff Michael had hired to help run the center. Basketball coaches, education specialists, a nurse for the clinic, kitchen workers, maintenance staff, all looked at Leroy with respect, ready to follow his leadership. "You'll meet with each of them over the next few weeks," Michael explained. "Learn about their backgrounds, their ideas for the center. You'll have final say on all programs and policies." As the day went on, Leroy grew more animated, the initial shock giving way to excitement. He discussed curriculum ideas with Letitia, facility management with Jerome, even computer systems with Tyler. Michael watched with satisfaction as his friend transformed before his eyes, shedding the weariness of his McDonald's job and standing straighter, despite his limp. By late afternoon, only Leroy, his children, and Michael remained. They sat in the dining area, drinking coffee and making plans for the weeks ahead. "We'll need to reach out to the schools," Leroy said. "Let them know what services we'll be offering." "Already arranged," Michael replied. "The principals are eager to partner with us. And transportation. Some kids won't be able to get here on their own." "We have 2 vans," Michael said, "and a contract with The city bus service for discounted passes. Leroy shook his head in amazement. "You've thought of everything." "I had good advisors," Michael said, nodding toward Leroy's children. "They know this community and what it needs." As the sun began to set, casting golden light through the windows, Michael stood to leave. He had a flight to catch. Business that couldn't be postponed any longer. "I'll be back for the grand opening in 6 weeks," he promised. "But this is your center now, Leroy. Your vision, your leadership." Leroy walked him to the door. The two men stood facing each other, a lifetime of experiences between them. "Why did you do all this, Mike?" Leroy asked softly. "Really?" Michael considered the question. "Because when I saw you at McDonald's, I realized something. Success isn't just about what you achieve or what you own. It's about the lives you touch. You touched mine when we were kids. Now you can touch hundreds more." He paused, looking around at the center that would soon be filled with children's voices and laughter. "And maybe because I needed to know that I could use what I've been given to make a real difference. Not just donations or appearances, but something lasting. Something that matters." Leroy nodded slowly. "Thank you. Doesn't seem enough." "It's more than enough," Michael assured him. "Just make this place everything those kids need it to be." They embraced, no longer the NBA superstar and the McDonald's worker, but simply two friends who had found each other again after a lifetime apart. As Michael walked to his car, he felt lighter than he had in years. The center would be Leroy's legacy, but it was also his own. A way to honor the friendship that had helped shape him before fame and fortune changed his life forever. Behind him, Leroy stood in the doorway of the Wilson and Jordan Youth Center, key in hand, ready to begin the next chapter of his journey. 6 months passed quickly. Leroy dedicated himself completely to preparing for the center's opening. He completed his nonprofit management training with top marks, impressing his instructors with his practical questions and thoughtful insights. The center took shape around him. Basketball courts were polished to a high shine. Computers were installed and tested. Books filled the library shelves. The kitchen was stocked with equipment and supplies. Most importantly, Leroy built his team, with Jerome handling operations and Letitia overseeing education programs. He focused on the heart of their mission, connecting with the kids who would soon fill these spaces. Leroy visited every school in the district, speaking with principals, counselors, and teachers. He attended community meetings, church services, and local sports events, spreading the word about the center and its programs. "We're not just offering basketball," he explained repeatedly. "We're offering belonging, support, guidance, a place where every child matters." Michael stayed involved from a distance, calling weekly for updates and sending equipment, books, and supplies as needed. But true to his word, he let Leroy take the lead. This was Leroy's vision now. Michael was just helping make it possible. Finally, opening day arrived, a bright Saturday morning in October. A red ribbon stretched across in the center's main entrance. Colorful balloons decorated the front of the building. A banner proclaimed, "Grand Opening, Wilson and Jordan Youth Center, all welcome." By 9 o'clock, a crowd had gathered. Families with children, teenagers, community leaders, local media. Word had spread that Michael Jordan himself would attend, drawing even more attention to the event. Leroy stood nervously near the entrance, dressed in a new suit that his children had insisted on buying him for the occasion. His family surrounded him, Jerome looking professional in a blazer, despite leaning on his cane, Letitia in a bright dress, Denise with young Marcus holding her hand, and Tyler, who had taken the day off from his college classes. "You ready "For this, Dad?" Jerome asked, seeing his father's anxious expression. Leroy took a deep breath. "As ready as I'll ever be." A sleek black SUV pulled up, and Michael stepped out, dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than Leroy had. Earned in a year at McDonald's. The crowd murmured with excitement, phones raised to capture photos of the basketball legend. Michael made his way through the crowd, stopping to shake hands and sign autographs. When he reached Leroy, he pulled him into a warm embrace. "Today's your day," Michael said quietly. "You deserve this moment." A podium had been set up near the Yours ribbon. The mayor of Wilmington stepped up first, offering a brief welcome and congratulations to the city's newest community resource. She spoke about the importance of investing in young people and expressed gratitude to Michael Jordan for bringing this gift to his hometown. When it was Michael's turn to speak, he kept his remarks brief. "I'm known for what I did on the basketball court," he told the crowd. "But long before I was winning championships, I was a skinny kid from Wilmington with a dream. That dream might never have become reality without Leroy Wilson." Michael gestured toward Leroy, who stood to the side, uncomfortable with the attention. "This man taught me my first crossover dribble," Michael continued. "He believed in me before anyone else did. Today, we're opening this center so that every child in Wilmington has someone who believes in them, someone like Leroy." When Michael finished, he motioned for Leroy to join him at the podium. The crowd applauded as Leroy stepped forward, his limp more noticeable as he navigated the small set of stairs. Leroy hadn't planned to speak. He'd assumed Michael would handle that part. But now, facing the expectant crowd, he cleared his throat and found his voice. "I'm not used to speeches," he began. "Until 6 months ago, I was flipping burgers at McDonald's. But I've always believed that every child deserves a chance to dream big and the support to make those dreams real." His voice grew stronger as he continued, passion overcoming his nervousness. "This center isn't just about basketball, though we'll certainly play plenty of that." The crowd chuckled. "It's about creating a community where young people can find their path, whatever that might be, where they can get help with homework, learn computer skills, eat a good meal, or just have a safe place to be after school." Leroy looked at Michael, standing tall beside him. "I'm grateful beyond words to my old friend for making this possible. But a building is just a building until it's filled with life and purpose. That's where all of you come in. This center belongs to this community. To all of you." The crowd responded with enthusiastic applause. Michael handed Leroy a large pair of ceremonial scissors. Together, they cut the red ribbon, officially opening the Wilson and Jordan Youth Center. Children rushed forward, eager to explore the new facility. Leroy and Michael led tours, showing off the basketball courts, the computer lab, the library, the game room, the kitchen. Local news cameras followed them, capturing the excitement of the day. Reporters interviewed Leroy about his vision for the center and his long-ago friendship with Michael Jordan. "It's like something out of a movie," one reporter said. "Childhood friends reunited after all these years, coming together to help the next generation." By afternoon, the formal ceremonies were over, but the center remained packed with visitors. Michael and Leroy found a quiet moment in the office marked with Leroy's name. "You did it," Michael said, sinking into a chair. "Look at all those kids out there. They already love this place." "We did it," Leroy corrected him. "I still can't believe any of this is real," Michael smiled. "Better get used to it. This is your life now, Executive Director Wilson." Leroy laughed, shaking his head. 6 months ago, he'd been worried about making rent on his small apartment. Now he had a new job, a new purpose, even a new apartment in a better neighborhood. Another of Michael's quiet gifts. When they returned to the main area, Michael was mobbed by children asking for autographs. He signed basketballs, shirts, scraps of paper, anything the kids presented to him. But what struck Leroy most was how many children also approached him, having heard his speech or simply sensing his genuine interest in them. They called him Mr. Wilson with respect, asked him questions about the center's programs, told him about their own dreams. As the day ended and the last visitors departed, Leroy's staff gathered for a final meeting before the center would officially open for regular programs on Monday. Looking around at these dedicated people, including his own children, Leroy felt a sense of purpose he'd never experienced before. Michael had a flight to catch that evening, but before leaving, he and Leroy stood together on the basketball court, the space now quiet after the day's excitement. "Thank you," Leroy said simply. "Not just for the center, but for remembering me after all these years." Michael smiled. "Some people you never forget, no matter how much time passes. You're one of those people." Leroy, they promised to stay in touch, to meet whenever Michael visited Wilmington. This time, there would be no decades of silence between them. As Michael's car pulled away, Leroy remained inside the center, walking slowly through the quiet rooms. Tomorrow, these spaces would be filled with children's voices, with learning and play and possibility. After all these years, Leroy Wilson had found his true calling. 1 year passed, bringing both triumphs and challenges to the Wilson and Jordan Youth Center. The center quickly became a vital part of the Wilmington community, with over 200 children attending programs regularly. Leroy worked tirelessly, often arriving before dawn and leaving long after sunset. His dedication inspired his staff, who matched his commitment with their own. The basketball program flourished under the guidance of coaches Leroy had personally selected. Several local tournaments had already been won by the center's teams, their trophies proudly displayed in the case next to Leroy's childhood basketball. The academic support program, led by Letitia, helped dozens of students improve their grades. The computer lab buzzed with activity as children learned skills that would prepare them for future careers. The kitchen served healthy meals that, for some children, were the only reliable food they received. Michael visited quarterly, sometimes bringing other NBA stars to hold special clinics. These visits created tremendous excitement, with children lining up for hours for a chance to meet their heroes. Michael always made sure Leroy stood beside him during these events, reinforcing that this was their center, their shared vision. But success brought its own challenges. The center became so popular that they had to create waiting lists for some programs. Leroy hated turning any child away, but space and staff were limited. "We need to expand," he told Michael during one of his visits. "There are kids we're not reaching, especially in the East Side neighborhoods." Michael nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking the same thing. Maybe it's time to look at a second location." The idea took root, with Michael's team researching potential properties and Leroy developing plans for additional programs. The vision was growing beyond what either of them had initially imagined. Leroy's health improved dramatically during this time. No longer spending long hours on his feet at McDonald's, his limp lessened. Regular checkups and proper medical care, which Michael had quietly arranged, addressed issues that had gone untreated for years. His family thrived too. Jerome's position as operations manager utilized his military leadership skills perfectly. Letitia found deeper satisfaction in developing educational programs than she had in traditional classroom teaching. Even Tyler, still in college, gained valuable experience managing the center's technology systems. But not everything was smooth sailing. Some children came to the center carrying heavy burdens: poverty, neglect, violence in their homes or neighborhoods. These kids needed more than basketball and tutoring. They needed deeper intervention. One such child was Deshaun, a 14-year-old with obvious basketball talent, but an angry, defensive attitude. Leroy learned that the boy's older brother was in a gang, pressuring Deshaun to join. His mother worked 2 jobs and was rarely home. His father was in prison. Leroy took a special interest in Deshaun, staying late to shoot hoops with him, listening without judgment when the boy occasionally opened up. Progress was slow and uneven. Some days, Deshaun wouldn't show up at all. Other days, he'd arrive with suspicious bruises or a hardened look in his eyes that worried Leroy deeply. "I don't know if we're reaching him in time," Leroy confessed to Jerome one evening. "The streets are pulling hard." "You can't save everyone, Dad," Jerome said gently. "But you're giving him a chance, which is more than he had before." Leroy knew his son was right, but it didn't make the situation any easier. For every Deshaun who struggled, there were dozens of success stories. But Leroy felt each failure personally, wondering what more he could do. The stress took a toll. There were nights when Leroy slept on the couch in his office, too exhausted to drive home. His children worried about him pushing himself too hard, especially given his age. Michael noticed, too, during his visits. "You need to pace yourself," he advised. "This is a marathon, not a sprint." "There's so much to do," Leroy replied. "So many kids who need help." "And they're getting it," Michael assured him. "But they need you healthy and strong. The center can't run without you." Leroy tried to heed this advice, delegating more responsibilities to his capable staff. But his passion for the work made it difficult to step back. Another challenge emerged when funding for similar centers in other neighborhoods proved harder to secure than expected. Despite Michael's wealth and influence, bureaucratic obstacles and competing interests sometimes slowed progress. Leroy found himself in meetings with city officials and potential donors, advocating for expansion with an eloquence that surprised even himself. "When did you become such a good speaker?" Michael teased after Leroy delivered a particularly moving presentation to the city council. "When I found something worth speaking up for," Leroy answered simply. Through all the successes and setbacks, the friendship between Leroy and Michael deepened. Their regular calls and visits were no longer just about the center, but about their families, their health, their reflections on life. The decades they had spent apart seemed to matter less as they created new memories together. One evening, after most of the staff had gone home, Leroy sat alone in the trophy room. He gazed at the worn leather basketball in its display case, thinking about how far he had come from those days on the neighborhood court. His life had taken an unexpected turn, giving him purpose and meaning he had never imagined possible. The center wasn't perfect. The challenges were real and sometimes daunting, but every day, children walked through those doors and found something they needed. Whether it was a meal, a tutor, a basketball coach, or simply an adult who believed in them. Just as Leroy had once believed in a skinny kid named Michael Jordan. On the 1-year anniversary of the Wilson and Jordan Youth Center, a small celebration was held for staff and key supporters. No media this time, no crowds of onlookers, just the people who had made the center's first year a success. After the cake was cut and speeches given, Michael asked Leroy to join him on the rooftop. A small seating area had been created there, with plants and comfortable chairs, a quiet retreat from the busy center below. The evening was warm, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The two friends sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, looking out over the city where they'd both grown up. "I've been meaning to tell you something," Leroy said finally. "Something I've never told anyone outside my family." Michael turned. To him, curious. "What is it?" Leroy took a deep breath. "The real reason we left Wilmington wasn't my grandmother's illness. That was just what we told people." He looked down at his hands, weathered by years of hard work. "My father was accused of stealing from the warehouse where he worked. He didn't do it. But in those days, a black man accused by a white manager didn't stand much chance of being believed." Michael listened quietly, understanding the weight of what Leroy was sharing. Dad was afraid of being arrested, of going to jail for something he didn't do. So we left in the night, changed our names slightly from Wilson to Wilkins, and started over in Georgia. "That's why I could never find you," Michael said softly. "I looked over the years." Leroy nodded. "We kept a low profile for a long time. No forwarding address, no connections to Wilmington. Dad was paranoid about being found, even years later." He sighed. "I wanted to say goodbye to you, Mike. I begged my parents to let me call you, but they were too scared. Said we couldn't risk anyone knowing where we'd gone." Michael's mind raced back to that summer when his friend had vanished without a word. It must have been hard, leaving everything behind like that. "It was," Leroy admitted. "New school, new neighborhood, no friends. But the hardest part was not saying goodbye to you. I knew you'd think I just abandoned our friendship, our pact." He, Atum, looked up at the stars. "My father was cleared 2 years later. Another employee confessed to the theft. But by then, we had built a new life in Georgia. Dad had a good job. We didn't want to uproot everything again." "Why didn't you contact me then?" Michael asked. Leroy smiled sadly. "At first, I was embarrassed. Then, as the years passed, it seemed too late. And once you became famous," he shrugged. "What was I supposed to say? Hey, remember me, your long-lost childhood friend?" "I would have remembered," Michael said. "I know that now." Leroy turned to look directly at Michael. "Every time I saw you on TV winning championships, I felt like a part of me was there with you. I was so proud, Mike. So proud." Michael was silent for a long moment, absorbing the truth that had been hidden for so many decades. The mystery of Leroy's disappearance finally solved. "Thank you for telling me," he said at last. Below them, the center hummed with activity. Even after the celebration ended, programs continued. The sound of basketballs bouncing on hardwood drifted up along, with children's voices and laughter. "Listen to that," Leroy said. "That sound, that's what matters now. What happened back then led us here, to this moment. I wouldn't change it." Michael nodded, understanding. The past had shaped them both, brought them to this rooftop, to this shared achievement. As darkness fell completely, they stood together at the edge of the roof, looking out over the neighborhood where they'd grown up, the youth center below them buzzing with activity. Two lives that took wildly different paths, now reconnected to create something meaningful together. In the gym below, a young boy hit his first successful jump shot under the guidance of a volunteer coach, his face lighting up with the same joy young Michael had felt decades ago on a cracked concrete court under the watchful eye of his friend. That's it for today's incredible story about Michael Jordan and his childhood friend Leroy. Where are you listening from? Drop your location in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button to help spread this message of kindness and friendship with others. And if you enjoyed this tale of reconnection and giving back, click on the video appearing on your screen right now for another inspiring story. Remember, sometimes the greatest acts of kindness come from remembering where we started and helping others along their journey. Until next time.